What's going on, guys? So I've had a lot of people ask me recently how some of my builds have been put together. I've talked about it with a few people, and everybody's kind of made the general recommendation, hey man, you should make some videos and make it easier on yourself and everybody else. So that's what we're doing here today. Making some videos on the different builds that I have, and today we're going to start with just a standard DPS build. You'd be surprised how many people just don't understand how to put the right pieces together in the right order to make things work to maximize on your DPS. And this is generally the best, most accepted DPS build that's out there right now. There's a few variations, and we'll go over some of those. But what you see on the screen is what you're looking at. We're going with three-piece Providence. So we've got the mask, the backpack, and the chest piece. We're using the named contractor's gloves for DPS, and I'll explain why we're using those, as well as Fox Prayer for the knee pads. Very important, these two, and I'll explain why in just a second. And then lastly, we're using the Cheska holster, and I'll explain why in just a second. So let's head over to the target range real quick, and I'll go into a little bit more depth and detail as to what you're looking for in this build, what stats you're trying to, stat markers you're trying to hit to make sure that your DPS is where it needs to be or where you'd like it to be. So first off, let's take a look at the build again. Now, I'm going to go over the gear before I go over the weapons, but the weapons are just as important. So what you're looking for on your gear, in a mix of all things, you want all reds, right? So DPS is the meta right now. All reds is the way to go. Yeah, it makes you squishy, but the general idea of the current meta is you kill it before it kills you. And usually you'll have other people in your party that are able to support you to a certain extent to make sure that you're able to do your job and not die. Important stat markers we're looking for here. Crit chance. Right now, crit and crit damage are the absolute metas. So these are what you want to pay attention to. Now, with crit chance, you'll see I'm at just over 50%. The crit cap is actually 60%. But realistically, there's always going to be somebody in your group running with a Coyote Mask. And the Coyote Mask gives the entire group a crit chance buff, as well as a crit damage buff. But as long as you're at 50%, if somebody's proccing the Coyote Mask, it'll put you at cap. So anything more than this is wasted stats. You also might be the person wearing Coyote Mask, and if that's the case, you definitely want to stay at 50% because you're going to give yourself that buff that's going to put you up to 60. If you, for whatever reason, don't have anybody in your party wearing a Coyote Mask, which is extremely rare, you could make an argument that, hey man, I want to bump this up to max just to make sure, and that's fine. That's your personal preference. For me personally, I find that, as long as I'm hitting 50%, I'm where I need to be. The next most important stat we're going to look at is critical hit damage. And this is something you just want to load up on as much gear as you can. Put it anywhere you can. So long as you're meeting the crit chance requirement, then you dump everything into crit hit damage. Lastly is headshot damage. This is something that you don't really pay too much attention to. You get it where you can, but you don't strain yourself to try and add more headshot damage if it's not viable to do so. Headshot damage is great, and you should be aiming for the head. It will increase your damage by, for me personally, 128.8%, which is pretty huge, but it's nothing in comparison to crit chance and crit damage, so just keep that in mind. Beyond that, other things we're going to look at is our weapon damage stats. So if we scroll down here, we can see I have an all weapons damage bonus of 91.7%. That's coming off of my gear, as well as an LMG and rifle damage bonus. And now I'm using, for my weapons, as you can see, I'm using an LMG, which is the MG5, and I'm using the M1A. Now I know everybody knows about the M1A. It's huge, it's popular, it's tons of fun, tons of damage, and that's great. I see a lot of mixed usage of LMGs. Let me tell you right now, there is nothing that comes close to the damage output that an MG5 can do if it's statted correctly. A Negev would be a second place, but not even really close, and then everything else is light years behind the MG5. So if you can, you want to find yourself a really decent MG5. What you're looking for here is you want LMG damage, preferably max. Mine's a little shy. I've had a hard time finding a good MG5. I actually think most of the ones that I have I crafted, which is shocking. But what you're looking for here is LMG damage as close to max as possible. Damage to targets out of cover. These two stats do not change. They're native on the MG5 every time you get one. And then the secondary attribute, here we're looking for damage to armor. Damage to armor is a force multiplier, meaning that the damage that you deal is multiplied, not additive, multiplied by 6%. And this is before crit chance and crit damage. So this is a huge stat. I see a lot of people trying to run crit or some other things, and that's not bad. I mean, crit isn't bad to roll on an MG5, but if you really want to maximize on your damage, you want damage to armor here. Lastly, the talent Fast Hands. This is huge. You could pick a lot of other damage modifying talents, like Strained, for example, and put them here, and they would do okay. But let me tell you, when it comes to consistent DPS, which is what you need in raids and legendaries, nothing beats Fast Hands. Nothing at all. Not even close. So Fast Hands is where you want to go with this. It's going to make sure that your reloads are as quick as possible. Base reload time, you can see here, is 5.4 seconds on this MG5, which is forever, especially when you're doing a legendary and getting rushed by 3 mobs. So when you max this out, it makes it about the same reload rate as like an AR would be, which is huge. So this is definitely the layout that you're looking for on your MG5. Taking a look at the M1A, very similar. Again, my M1A could use some help here. It's not bad. It's not great. It is what it is. I've gotten what I can from drops. But beyond that, we're looking for rifle damage, crit hit damage. These are the native talents. You can't change these. And then the attribute here, damage out of cover is usually going to be better because you can get a higher percentage. But if you can't get damage out of cover, damage to armor works as well. The only difference is I think you can get a maximum of 8% or 10% damage to targets out of cover. Whereas damage to armor, I think your max is like 6 or 8%. So you're getting a little bit more out of the damage to targets out of cover. Again, it is a situational buff, but it is a multiplier. So when you hit it, it's going to do a lot more damage. As far as talents go, there is no comparison. Rifleman is king. You're talking about 50% extra weapon damage after you hit 5 headshots. And you should be aiming for the head with this weapon. No doubt about it. But there's nothing else that really comes close. Some people like to run breadbasket. I've seen a number of different other talents that aren't bad in comparison, but nothing really comes close to Rifleman. If you want to hit those big 5 mil, 6 mil headshots with your M1A, you're not going to do it without Rifleman. So just keep that in mind. So that's the weapons. The way we're modding these is we're going for as much crit as we can. So you can see I've got the ACOG on here for 5% crit. I've got the laser pointer for another 5% crit, and then the muzzle for 5% crit. So we're getting 15% crit just on this weapon alone, and somewhat similar to the Okay, let's try that again. There we go. Somewhat similar to the M1A. We have the 5% crit ACOG scope with the laser pointer. There is no muzzle attachment here, so you're not going to get that third 5%, but we're still getting 10% off here with the increased mag for the extra rounds. So again, like I said, crit is king. You want to try and get as much crit out there as possible. And you can get a huge chunk of the crit that you need just off your weapons alone, which frees up a lot more stats available on your gear, right? So taking a look at the gear, like I said, you can go one of two ways. I do have, in fact, I can go grab it really quick. I do have a decent coyote mask that I used to use from time to time. I've since taken it off because you actually get more damage without it. But here's an example of a coyote's mask. Mine's pretty good. I'm a little bit off on the crit chance, but everything else is god rolled. You can see the buffs here that you give. I don't know if anybody's ever taken the time to read this, but as long as you shoot a target within 15 to 25 meters, which is pretty average, you're giving yourself and your entire group 10% crit hit damage and crit hit chance. So that's your 10%. That's going to get you to cap right there. If it's closer, you're doing more crit hit damage. But if you really want to maximize on your damage, you're going to go with something like this. This is a Providence mask. As you can see, it does have headshot damage on it and no crit chance because I didn't need the extra crit chance, so it only made sense to, get something with headshot damage on it. But as you can see, I've got max weapon damage, which is always your top priority, followed by crit hit damage. Made sure my crit hit chance was capped, which it was, so that was fine. And then we finished it off with a crit hit damage mod that is capped. Going beyond that, we're looking at the chest piece. Very similar. Weapon damage, crit hit damage, headshot damage, crit hit damage again. And then the talent we're going for here is Glass Cannon. Now, Glass Cannon is going to make you super squish. We all know this, but it's really hard to argue with the amount of damage output that it can give you. Now, if this was perfect, this would be a sacrifice, which gives me 30% amplified damage and 60% damage taken, which is the named Providence chest piece. This one, I have some sacrifices. This one just happened to be better with the stats, so I rolled this one instead. But you could definitely use a sacrifice, that's fine. Other choices, if you really don't want to run Glass Cannon, some other choices that you could pick would be something with Unstoppable Force is a great one to have on there. It gives you the same amount of damage amplification without the damage intake, but you have to stack it. So each target you kill gives you 5% extra damage, stacks up to 5 times, 25%. So if you're moving through things quickly and you're constantly killing things, the Unstoppable Force would be a good option to take if you don't want to have the extra damage income. But if you want to make sure that you always have that 25% locked, stocked, and ready to go, Glass Cannon's the way to go. You just have to be careful with your exposure to enemies. Make sure you're not taking on too much threat. Make sure you're using cover properly, etc. Glass Cannon will help you out tremendously. Going down to the Cheska holster, the biggest reason we use the Cheska holster right here, 10% crit hit chance. It is the one piece of gear that you can get the most crit hit chance on, other than your weapons, of course, with the mods. This is huge. This frees up a lot of room for us to play around with other stats in our gear, including crit hit damage. So I highly recommend finding a decent Cheska holster. And realistically, you could alternate the holster and the mask. It's just easier this way because Providence rolls with a natural red mod slot, whereas some of these other ones don't, like Grupo rolls, I think, with a yellow mod slot, etc., etc. So this is the way I found easiest based on the gear that's dropped for me. And you'll just have to review your own situation to figure out what's going to be best for you. But anyway, weapon damage, crit hit damage, headshot damage. I didn't need crit chance here because I'm already where I need to be. So backpack, same general rule of thumb, all reds, weapon damage, headshot damage, crit hit chance. This is where I took on some crit hit chance just to make sure I was where I needed to be, and then finish it off with a crit hit damage mod. The talent is Vigilance. Again, this synergizes really well with Glass Cannon, I feel, because Glass Cannon, you don't want to take damage, because if you do, it's going to kill you pretty quick. So that being said, if you're doing your job and avoiding damage, Vigilance should stay up almost all the time. Gives you a free 25% damage to your weapon. If you take damage, it disables it for 4 seconds, but all you have to do is dive back into cover, wait that 4 seconds, and boom, it's back on again. No big deal. Definitely the best ready to go talent for damage on the backpack. There's some other choices here. You can take your own personal preference, but I'm pretty sure that if you ask around very widely, people would agree that Vigilance is the best way to go as far as damage goes. Now, the last two pieces. So we have Contractor's Gloves, which are named Petrov gloves. Now, it just so happens I'm using an LMG, so I do get the bonus effect from the LMG damage. But even if I was using an AR, I would still want to use these gloves because of this damage to armor. Now, before I told you, damage to armor is a force multiplier. All your damage is multiplied by that amount prior to crit chance and crit damage effects. So, there is no other stat on a pair of gloves that you can get for this slot that is going to produce as much damage as this does right here. So these are where you want to go with it. It's even better because we're using an LMG that we get the LMG damage on top of it. But like I said, even if I wasn't using an LMG, if I was using like an Eagle Bear or something like that, I would still want to use these gloves because of this multiplier right here. It gives me more damage. So that's the contractor's gloves. Pretty easy to get. I would say target either glove loot allocations or Petrov loot allocations. Run them on heroic. Guarantee you'll get a pair within a few runs. Especially if you take some friends with you and loot share, and you'll get them pretty quick. We want to try and get the weapon damage as high as possible. These ones aren't quite perfect. I haven't gotten the God Roll pair yet, but I'm sure they're coming. But this is what you're looking at for your gloves. Now, Fox's Prayer, same general idea. We have damage to targets out of cover, rolls naturally on these, and it always rolls at a maximum of 8%. This is the same idea, guys. This is another force multiplier. It's going to increase your damage by a multiplicative of 8%. You can't beat it. There's no other pair of knee pads that is going to give you as much damage as these two. And since we are using an M1A, we also do get the benefit of the rifle damage on top of it. So bear that in mind when you're putting your build together. Those are the things that you're generally looking for. As far as performance in a raid or anything like that, you're going to melt stuff really freaking fast with this build. The key is making sure that you stay alive. So you want to work with the other people in your team, use your cover properly, and make sure that you're utilizing all those tools you have available to you to mitigate against some of that damage. But as far as output damage, man, you're gonna toast stuff using this build pretty quickly. The sidearm doesn't really matter too much. I like using the sawed-off double-barreled because if I get something low and let's say my mag runs out, I can whip this out really fast, shot to the head. Pretty much anything's going to die at that point as long as it's low enough. No big deal. You can choose whatever you'd like here, but that's what I typically pick. As far as specializations go, for straight DPS, there's no comparison to Gunner. Gives you armor on kill. Also gives you rate of fire on kill. So there's some survivability and even more DPS output for you with this spec. I know some people use some other things, but as far as DPS goes, nothing gets better than Gunner for this spec. So that's about it for this build. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know or ask me in game or in Discord. Happy to help in whatever way I can. But this is your standard DPS build. Let me know what you guys think. Hit me up. Thanks. Bye.